Imagine a darkness so total that after a few hours, you can no longer tell whether your eyes are open or closed. Imagine air so thick with dust and heat that each breath feels like swallowing warm gravel. Imagine the sound of a mountain settling around you, low, geological groans that you feel in your sternum more than you hear with your ears. Imagine being somewhere so deep underground that you are closer to the Earth's mantle than you are to sunlight. Now imagine not knowing if anyone above you is looking. On August 5, 2010, 33 men descended into the San José copper and gold mine in northern Chile, in the middle of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest, most inhospitable places on the planet. They went down to work. They expected to come back up by evening. They would not see sunlight again for 69 days. This is the story of what it costs a human being to survive. The San José mine sits in the Atacama region near Copiapó, roughly 800 kilometers north of Santiago. The Atacama is not a romantic desert. It is not Lawrence of Arabia dunes and golden horizons. It is a place of raw mineral earth, grey and crumbling, where almost nothing grows and almost nothing moves. The air is bone dry. The sun is blinding. And beneath the surface, the mountains are riddled with tunnels where men have chased copper and gold for generations. The San José mine was operated by Compañía Minería San Esteban, a small private mining company with a history that, in retrospect, reads almost like a warning being issued over and over. Chilean mining regulators had documented serious safety violations at San José going back years before 2010, unstable rock formations, inadequate structural reinforcement, repeated accidents. In 2007, a miner named Manuel Villagran was killed at the same mine. The facility had been ordered closed more than once, but each time, after modifications, it reopened. In an economically depressed mining region where jobs were scarce and few questions were asked, men kept going back down. On the morning of August 5th, the shift began normally. 33 miners clocked in. Most of them knew the mine well. Some had worked it for years. They were not reckless men. They were workers, experienced, practical, men who understood that mines were dangerous the way sailors understand that oceans are dangerous. You respected the risk. You learned the signs. You trusted your colleagues. What none of them could have known is that deep inside the mountain above them, an enormous section of rock, later estimated at roughly 700,000 metric tons, a mass larger than the Empire State Building, had been slowly preparing to fall. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it fell. The sound of a mine collapse is not a single sound. Survivors describe it as something that starts before it starts. A pressure change, a shift in the air, a low vibration that rises through the soles of your boots before you can name it. And then the rock moves. The collapse at San José sent shock waves through the tunnel system like a fist slamming through a paper bag. Men were thrown. Dust, ancient mineral dust stored in the rock for millions of years, detonated through the shafts in thick choking clouds that turned the darkness absolute. The main ramp, the only vehicle access tunnel to the surface, was blocked. The ventilation shafts were compromised. The mountain had closed. When the dust began to settle, hours later, slowly, the 33 men found themselves gathered in a section of the mine called the Refugio, an emergency shelter carved roughly 700 meters below the surface, accessible by a narrow spiral tunnel. The Refugio was not a comfortable room. It was a rough-cut space about 50 meters long and perhaps 4 meters wide. It contained an emergency supply cache, basic first aid materials, and a quantity of food that had been designed to sustain a small number of men for, perhaps, 2 days. There were 33 of them, and as they sat in the Refugio in the hours after the collapse, listening to the mountain still shifting above them, they faced the first and most brutal truth of their situation. They had no way to communicate with the surface. The phones were dead. The radio equipment was unreachable or destroyed. The only people who knew where they were was the world outside, and the world outside did not yet know they were alive. Above ground, the landscape shifted into a different kind of crisis. Word of the collapse reached families within hours. The Camp Hope, as it would come to be called, began forming almost immediately outside the mine's entrance. Wives, mothers, brothers, daughters, men clutching photographs, women sitting on folding chairs in the Atacama sun with a particular stillness of people who have run out of ways to prepare themselves. The Chilean government was notified quickly. Sebastián Pinera, who had assumed the presidency just 5 months earlier, was briefed. Initial assessments from mining engineers were not encouraging. The collapse was massive. The structural instability was severe. Drilling through hundreds of meters of unstable fractured rock to find a space where survivors might exist, if survivors existed, was an engineering problem of enormous and uncertain complexity. In the first hours and days, rescue teams began making their assessments. Small exploratory drills probed downward, trying to find the cavity, the shelter that engineers hoped might have survived the collapse. The mountain, however, was not cooperative. Smaller secondary collapses continued in the days after August 5th. Every drill hole carried risk. Every advance through the fractured rock risked triggering another catastrophic fall. The families waited. They built a small city of tents and tarps on the desert floor. They brought photographs. They brought food for each other. They organized themselves with the quiet discipline of people who had decided, collectively, that despair was a luxury they couldn't afford, at least not yet. In the refugio, the 33 men confronted mathematics. The emergency ration cache contained enough food to sustain the group for roughly 48 hours at normal consumption. The miners understood, with professional clarity, what this meant. If rescue was not immediate, if any rescue was possible at all, they would have to ration in a way that stretched those supplies as far as physically possible. Under the leadership of shift foreman Luis Urzúa, and with the forceful presence of miner Mario Sepúlveda, who would emerge as an emotional anchor for the group, they organized themselves. They established a rationing system. Every 48 hours, each man received approximately a small spoonful of tuna, a half cracker, a half glass of milk, and a small piece of peach. These were not meal portions. These were gestures toward nutrition, symbolic more than caloric, a way of marking time and managing the psychological reality of starvation more than preventing it. The heat in the refugio was approximately 35 degrees Celsius, roughly 95 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity around 90%. This combination, in a space this confined, in this darkness, is something that the word uncomfortable doesn't begin to address. Sweat doesn't evaporate in that kind of humidity. It coats you. It pools. It collects on the rock walls and drips back as warm mineral water. The physical environment of the refugio was, in every technical sense, hostile to human life. The men had one functioning light source between them at first, which they managed carefully. Mostly, they lived in the dark. It is difficult to convey what total darkness does to a human being who has been inside it for an extended period. The brain is not built for complete absence of light. It begins to generate its own input, strange visual phenomena, spatial disorientation, the dissolution of normal sensory boundaries. Combined with starvation, heat, dehydration, and the ever-present acoustic reminder that 700 meters of mountain existed between them and the sky, the psychological pressure on these men was not simply severe. It was of a kind that very few human beings have ever experienced and returned from intact. They organized. They talked. They argued. They prayed. Many of them. They set tasks, assigned duties, tried to impose structure on a structureless reality. Mario Sepúlveda, his outsized personality becoming a kind of communal asset, worked to keep spirits moving. There were darker moments, too. Men broke. Men wept. Men sat alone in the tunnel sections and said nothing for hours. One of the miners, Yoni Barrios, had some basic medical training and became the group's de facto doctor, monitoring vital signs, watching for signs of dehydration and malnutrition, trying to manage the growing roster of physical complaints. An older miner, Mario Gomez, 63 years old, was dealing with the worst of the heat and physical deterioration. José Enriquez, a lay pastor, led group prayers. Some men who had never prayed before joined them. The darkness does things to a person's relationship with certainty. 17 days passed. On the surface, the drilling operations had become an engineering crisis in their own right. The Atacama rock at San José was not uniform. It was fractured, layered, unpredictable, a geological record of millions of years of volcanic activity and seismic shifting. Small drill bits designed for exploratory boring kept breaking, deflecting off unseen rock formations, or stopping when secondary collapses sealed new sections of the mine. The rescue teams went through 8 drill bits in the first 17 days. Each broken bit meant pulling the entire drill string to the surface, replacing the bit, and starting again. The engineers had established a rough target, the area around the refugio, but the problem of actually reaching that target in three-dimensional space, through rock formations they could not fully map, was immense. Some of the drill holes were coming close, but drilling is not a precise science in fractured stone. Errors of a few degrees over hundreds of meters of depth could mean missing by tens of meters. Families were told, carefully, that there was hope, that drilling was ongoing, that no effort would be spared. The Chilean government, understanding that this story was being watched by the entire world, committed publicly and completely to the rescue operation. International support began arriving, drilling equipment from the United States, Canada, South Africa, engineering expertise from across the hemisphere. The scale of resources being poured into the effort grew daily. But the honest answer to the question that hung over Camp Hope every waking hour, "Are they alive?" was, "We don't know." 17 days. On August 22, 2010, a drill broke through into an open space roughly 700 meters below the surface. The drill operators felt the change, the slight give in resistance that indicated the bit had entered a cavity. They pulled the drill string upward. Attached to the drill head, when it came out of the hole, were 2 notes secured with electrical tape. One was a statement of position, written in engineering shorthand, confirming the location of the cavity. The second, written in red marker on a piece of paper torn from a packaging label, was 8 words in Spanish. Estamos bien en el refugio los 33. We are well in the refuge. The 33. The moment that message was read aloud on the surface, by drilling foreman Roberto Rios, who had to pause, who had to stop and breathe, there are no words adequate to what happened in Camp Hope. 17 days of controlled terror released itself all at once. People who had not permitted themselves to cry for 2.5 weeks collapsed onto each other. Mothers who had not slept, who had organized vigils and prayers and press conferences with the rigid economy of people managing unspendable grief, simply broke open. All 33 men were alive. Below ground, they had no immediate way of knowing the drill had reached them. The note had been attached by the miners themselves to the drill head when it first punched through. A desperate, practiced gesture, the result of days of planning and waiting for just this possibility. They had been listening for drilling sounds for weeks, tracking the direction of the noise, discussing what to do if a drill actually broke through. When it did, they were ready. When communication was finally established, through a narrow supply tube that the drill hole became, the miners' first calls to their families were monitored and guided by psychologists who had been brought to the site specifically to manage these conversations. The calls were brief. They had to be. The emotional weight on both ends was extraordinary. Several miners broke down entirely. Several couldn't speak at all. The global media coverage that had been building since the first reports of the collapse now became something else entirely. 33 men alive after 17 days, 700 meters underground, with the most complex rescue operation in mining history still ahead of them. This was not just a news story. It became something the world watched with a kind of desperate collective attention, the way people watch things that remind them of what human beings are actually capable of. The rescue plan took shape over weeks, and it was, by any measure, an engineering challenge at the frontier of what was technically possible. There were 3 parallel drilling operations, given the names Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Each used different drilling technology and approached the rescue shaft from different angles. The goal was to drill a shaft large enough to lower a rescue capsule, a cylinder roughly 54 centimeters in diameter, through 700 meters of unstable rock to the refugio, extract the miners one by one, and return them safely to the surface. The capsule itself was developed by Chilean Navy engineers in collaboration with NASA consultants and named the Phoenix. The Phoenix. It was a narrow metal cylinder with a small window, a harness, an oxygen supply, communication capability, and a set of wheels designed to keep it centered in the shaft and manage the rotation that would inevitably occur during a 700-meter ascent through irregular stone. The interior space of the capsule was, to put it plainly, extremely confined, barely large enough for a single adult human being who had been specifically conditioned to endure claustrophobic spaces. There was an additional complication. Several of the miners, after 60-plus days of minimal calories and no exercise, had actually lost significant body weight, which helped them fit inside the capsule, but raised serious medical concerns about their physical state. Others had developed serious conditions: dental abscesses that could not be properly treated underground, skin infections, blood pressure abnormalities, silicosis-like respiratory symptoms from weeks of breathing mine air. The mine's medical team above ground was communicating with the mine's de facto doctor, Yoni Barrios, on a daily basis, trying to manage conditions from hundreds of meters away. Plan B's drill, a Schramm T685 rig, made the fastest progress. The drilling operators worked in shifts around the clock. The fractured rock remained the constant enemy, and there were moments during the drilling when secondary collapses inside the shaft forced complete reassessments. But the machine moved forward. On October 9, 2010, 64 days after the collapse, the Plan B drill broke through into the refugio. The shaft was then widened to accommodate the Phoenix capsule. A final engineering check was run. The casing pipes that would line the upper section of the rescue shaft were installed. On October 13, 2010, the rescue began. The first man to ascend was Florencio Avalos, 31 years old, who had been selected partly for his relatively good physical condition and his calm temperament. The rescue teams needed to know the capsule worked as designed before sending up men in more fragile states. He entered the Phoenix capsule at the bottom of the shaft. The capsule rose. Those watching the live feed on the surface, and hundreds of millions of people were watching around the world, saw the data. The capsule's position tracked in real time, the depth counter on the screens at the surface slowly ticking upward as 700 meters of rock slid past. The ascent took roughly 15 minutes. In Camp Hope, the crowd gathered around the rescue shaft in the desert darkness. It was past midnight in Chile, and watched a circle of light in the ground. When Florencio Avalos emerged, the sound from Camp Hope crossed over into something beyond noise. It was biological. The roar of a crowd who had been holding their breath for 69 days, finally exhaling all at once. His wife held him. His son held him. He looked dazed, the disorientation of a man who has moved from the deepest darkness into the bright lights of an international media event in the span of 15 minutes. The capsule went back down. It would go back down 32 more times. Miner after miner. Each one a story. Mario Sepulveda, the second to ascend, emerged from the capsule with something approaching theatrical energy. He distributed rocks from the mine as souvenirs to the rescue workers. He pumped his fists. He howled his relief at the sky. The crowd went wild. Then he broke down completely in private. The youngest miner, Jimmy Sanchez, 19 years old, came up and walked into his mother's arms and could not speak. The oldest, Mario Gomez, 63, emerged from the capsule and knelt on the desert floor. He had written his wife a letter while underground, a letter he had been unsure she would ever receive, and when he saw her standing there in the lights, he appeared for a moment not to believe she was real. The rescue took approximately 22 hours from the first extraction to the last. It went without a single mechanical failure. The Phoenix capsule made 33 round trips, rising and descending in the dark, each time returning empty to the bottom of the shaft, each time returning full to the surface. The last man to come up was Luis Urzua, the shift foreman, the man who had organized the group's survival underground from the first hours. He and Panera, the president who had promised the miners and their families on national television that he would not leave until all 33 were out, embraced on the surface as the final capsule rose. Urzua said to the president, "I have handed over my shift. We all came back. 69 days. 700 meters of rock. 33 men. The world had watched. More than 1 billion people, it was estimated, followed some portion of the rescue via live broadcast. It was one of the most watched events in television history. The images, the dark shaft, the rising capsule, the eruptions of joy at each emergence, circulated everywhere. But what the cameras captured in those hours outside the mine was something different from what existed inside the men who came out of it. Post-traumatic stress disorder among the 33 is well documented. In the years following the rescue, numerous miners reported severe psychological difficulties, depression, anxiety, relationship breakdown, an inability to return to work, recurring nightmares. Several struggled with substance use. The transition from 69 days of collective crisis, where purpose and camaraderie were structurally enforced by necessity, to the disorienting normalcy of ordinary life, with bills and marriages and children and an ordinary Chilean morning, proved, for many of them, nearly unbridgeable. Mario Sepulveda, whose energy and charisma had helped hold the group together underground, spoke publicly about the emotional crash that came after the rescue. The world had given them a moment of extraordinary celebration. The world then moved on. The miners were left with what they had brought back with them. Several sued the mining company. Compañía Minería San Esteban ultimately declared bankruptcy. The legal and financial resolutions were, for most of the 33, deeply unsatisfying. The men who had been celebrated by presidents and cheered by 1 billion people received modest compensation at best. Some remained in financial precarity for years. The San José mine was never reopened. There are things that the documentation and the testimonies and the official reports cannot fully capture, things that existed only in the refugio, in the heat and darkness and complete absence of certainty, during those 17 days before the note, before anyone on the surface had confirmed that these men were still breathing. What does a human being think about in the dark, when the mountain has closed, when communication is severed, when the rational assessment of the situation offers no particular reason for hope? The miners spoke about it, in interviews, in the years that followed. Some said they thought about their families with an intensity they had never experienced in ordinary life, that in the refugio, the faces of wives and children became almost physically present, more real in some ways than the rock walls around them. Some said they thought about nothing, that they retreated into a kind of internal blankness that was, perhaps, a form of psychological self-preservation. Some said they prayed. Some said they stopped believing in the things they had always believed in. All of them said something changed. Not in a cinematic, dramatic way. Not in the way that crisis movies depict the survivors of disasters. The sudden clarity, the transformation, the return to life with new purpose and wisdom. The change was more broken than that. More complicated. It was the change that happens to a person who has genuinely sat with the question of whether they will survive, for weeks, in the dark, and then discovered that the answer was yes. How do you carry something like that back into a world that has kept moving in your absence? In 2010, 469 days, 33 men held each other together in a space the size of a studio apartment carved from rock, half a kilometer underground, in the middle of the driest desert on Earth. They ate almost nothing. They breathed air that tasted of stone and sweat. They lived, collectively, inside an uncertainty so complete that hope and despair became almost the same thing. The world watched them come out of the mountain, one by one, into the camera lights and the roar of the crowd and the arms of their families. It was extraordinary. It was genuinely, uncomplicatedly extraordinary. But the part that lingers, the part that resists resolution, is the 17 days before anyone knew they were there. The darkness before the drill broke through. The hours and days inside a mountain that did not care whether they were alive, in a world that did not yet know they were alive, deciding, without any particular reason to believe it would matter, to stay alive anyway. That is what survival actually looks like. Not the rescue. Not the emergence into the light. The quiet decision, made again and again, in total darkness, to endure one more hour. 33 men made that decision. 33 men came home. The mountain kept everything else.